It was supposed to be a simple segment on a national morning radio show. Lighthearted, nostalgic, harmless. Senator John Kennedy had been invited to share stories from his upbringing as part of a special called Voices of America. But what unfolded that morning would leave the country stunned, a nation silent, and a legendary actor completely undone. The show had just returned from commercial break. The host, cheerful and polished, leaned into the mic and said, "Joining us now is a man who says he learned more on his mother's porch swing than in any classroom, Senator John Kennedy." Kennedy chuckled politely and greeted the room with that thick Southern accent of his, the kind that felt like warm cornbread and Sunday hymns. He spoke just a few words, enough to paint the image of growing up in Louisiana with a broken porch and a Bible missing half its cover, when the air shifted. Without warning, a second voice burst into the room, deeper, louder, and laced with smirking sarcasm. "Well, well, well," the voice said. "Is this a history lesson, or are we auditioning for a Cracker Barrel commercial?" It was Robert De Niro. No one knew he'd been booked. The host looked confused. The sound engineer missed the cue to mute, and suddenly, live across the country, De Niro sat down beside Kennedy and leaned into the mic like a boxer entering the ring. He mocked the senator's accent outright, exaggerating every syllable. "I mean, really, can someone translate? I think he just said y'all 4 times in one sentence. I thought this was public radio, not a rodeo prayer circle." There was nervous laughter in the studio. The host tried to laugh it off, but even he looked unsettled. Kennedy said nothing. He smiled politely, hands folded, eyes steady. And then De Niro doubled down. "This man talks like punctuation was optional. Who let the hayfield preacher in here?" That was when it happened. The phone lines lit up. One particular call broke through the noise. A young girl, maybe 8 or 9, was patched in live. Her voice cracked as she said, "Mr. De Niro, my daddy talks like that too. Please don't make fun of us." The entire room froze. The tension was no longer awkward. It was sacred. De Niro leaned back in his chair, and for the first time looked unsure. The host, flustered, asked if they should go to a break, but Kennedy finally spoke. "No," he said, his voice low and steady. "Let me tell you a story." And friends, what he said next would flip the entire broadcast on its head. Before we go there, take a second. If you're feeling what just happened, if something in your gut twisted a little when that little girl spoke up, hit that like button and drop a 9 in the comments. Let us know you're still here, still listening, still thinking, because what's about to come might be the most important thing you'll hear all day. Senator Kennedy didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone had shifted. Subtle, deliberate, like the calm before a southern storm. "When I was a boy," he began, "my mama didn't have time for fancy words. She had 3 jobs, 2 bad knees, and a Bible that was held together with tape and faith. We didn't pronounce things the way they do in universities. We pronounced them the way they felt." The room was still, and even the soft whir of the air conditioning seemed to fade. Kennedy leaned forward slightly, his hands resting gently on the edge of the table, and continued. "I remember one Friday night, I was reading scripture aloud on our front porch. Mama always made me read before supper. I got stuck on a word, stuttered over it, and threw the Bible down. I said, 'Why's it matter? No one talks like this anyway.'" He paused. She picked that book up, kissed it, and said, "It matters because every word you speak teaches the world how to treat you. Don't you ever let them shame your voice. It ain't broken, it's just honest." Across the studio, De Niro sat unusually still, one hand resting on his knee, his earlier swagger nowhere in sight. Kennedy glanced his way for the first time. "Robert," he said, not with bitterness but with a quiet challenge, "you've played kings, boxers, men who conquered empires, but the strongest man I ever knew was a janitor named Levi, who cleaned church floors in silence and quoted Proverbs like it was his own poetry. No spotlight, no applause, just truth. The host shifted in his chair, sensing something heavy unfolding. Kennedy didn't stop. I still remember the first time I had to speak in court. I was fresh out of law school, state school, not Ivy, and the first thing the prosecutor said to me, right there in front of the judge, was, "Try not to sound so country, counselor." A few in the studio winced. Kennedy nodded. And I remember what the judge told me when court recessed. He leaned over and whispered, "Don't change a thing, son. You sound like the truth used to sound." The tension was transforming. This was no longer a radio segment. It had become a reckoning, a re-education of what it meant to carry truth, not in the polish of your words, but in the weight of your stories. Kennedy continued, more personal now, more exposed. My daddy had calloused hands and couldn't read past a 5th grade level, but he taught me what honor looked like when he gave his last paycheck to a neighbor who couldn't afford insulin. You won't read that in any textbook. And it wasn't broadcast on national television, but it's the moment that taught me what leadership actually means. His voice cracked slightly. It means showing up, not showing off. Then he leaned back slightly and looked around the room. You know what education taught me, Robert? That you can memorize every word in a script and still miss the point. You can win every award in Hollywood and still lose yourself if you forget who your voice really belongs to. And then came the twist that no one expected. Kennedy reached into his coat pocket and slowly pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was yellowed, creased at the edges, clearly old. "This," he said, "is a poem my mama wrote the week my brother died." She read it to me that night on the porch, and she stuttered every line. But it was the most beautiful sound I ever heard, because it was real. He unfolded it carefully, hands trembling just slightly, and read, "Let them mock your words, son, and shame your tone. But never forget, your voice is your own. Silence, heavy, thick, holy." De Niro's jaw clenched, not from anger but from something he hadn't expected, humility. The kind that comes not from defeat, but from truth finally piercing pride. Kennedy folded the paper and placed it on the table between them. "You mocked the way I sound. That's fine. But remember this. Some of us were never taught how to impress. We were taught how to endure." A producer in the control room whispered, "Keep it rolling. Don't cut." And for once, Robert De Niro had nothing left to say. The studio hung in that silence like it was holding its breath. Even the blinking "on air" sign above them seemed to pulse more slowly, as if respecting what had just happened. Kennedy didn't press the moment. He let it stretch, let the weight of his mother's words linger in the air. And then, with the ease of a man who's lived through both storm and drought, he continued. "You know, Robert," he said softly, "there's a man who runs the diner back in my hometown. Folks call him Big Al, not because he's tall, but because his voice fills a room like a choir. Thick Cajun drawl, strong as syrup. Most people, tourists mostly, laugh the moment he speaks, think he's slow, think he's dumb, until he finishes quoting the Constitution, front to back, from memory." Kennedy turned toward De Niro now, his voice not angry, just grounded in something deeper. "I once asked Big Al how he memorized so much, and he said, 'Senator, when the world assumes you're dumb, the smartest thing you can do is listen.'" The host's mouth twitched slightly, like he wanted to say something but didn't dare interrupt. Kennedy leaned in a little closer to the mic, his tone dipping into the lower register. "I don't carry a diploma from Harvard, Robert. I carry the names of men who built bridges and never got to walk across them. I carry verses that were whispered over dying soldiers. I carry lessons from mothers who could barely write but taught with every breath." Then came the unexpected twist. Kennedy glanced down at the soundboard in front of him and casually asked the audio engineer, "Can you play back what Mr. De Niro said about me earlier?" The engineer hesitated, clearly uncertain, but Kennedy nodded again. "Please, I want to hear it again." Out loud. The audio crackled as the earlier recording played back. De Niro's exaggerated Southern drawl, his comment about a Cracker Barrel commercial, and the mocking line about grammar in barns. The room tensed. De Niro fidgeted. Kennedy closed his eyes for just a moment, then opened them and spoke. "That voice you made fun of," he said, "that's the voice my mama used to sing me to sleep. That's the voice my brother used when he called home from the front lines. That's the voice of every farmer, nurse, truck driver, and waitress who built this country one broken sentence at a time." He looked directly at De Niro now. "You can mock my accent. You can laugh at my cadence, but what you're really mocking is the sound of struggle, the sound of survival, the sound of people who don't get paid to perform but keep showing up anyway." The host leaned back in his chair, clearly stunned by the rawness of the moment. De Niro blinked slowly, arms crossed now more in defense than defiance. Kennedy's voice softened. "You've played men who stood for something, Robert. But what do you stand for when the cameras aren't rolling? Do you listen when no one's watching? Do you respect the ones who speak with cracked voices, not perfect ones?" The tension in the room had shifted again, from confrontation to reflection. You could feel it. Even through the radio waves, across the country, cars pulled over on highways, coffee shops fell quiet, and kitchens went still. And then, Kennedy said something no one expected. He leaned in, not toward the mic, but toward De Niro himself. "You once said in an interview that acting was about truth, that if you didn't believe it, neither would the audience." Kennedy nodded slowly. "Well, I'm not acting. And this audience, they believe every word, because it's not polished, it's lived." A pause. One long beat of eye contact between two men from opposite worlds, and then Kennedy delivered a line that would be clipped, quoted, and replayed across every corner of the internet within hours. "I may not speak your language, Robert, but I speak mine, and where I'm from, that's enough." There it was, the sentence that broke through, not because it was loud, but because it was true. A low murmur rippled through the room. The audio engineer wiped his eyes without realizing it. The host nodded slowly, speechless, and De Niro, once cocky, once amused, now sat still, as if seeing something for the first time. Not Kennedy, but everything he stood for. The weight of generations who never needed a spotlight to be worthy of respect. Kennedy straightened his shoulders, placed his mother's worn paper back in his pocket, and said quietly, "So, if anyone listening out there ever felt like their voice didn't belong, like their accent disqualified them from being heard, let me be clear. You don't need to change how you speak to be worthy. You just need to remember that your voice carries every story your ancestors couldn't finish telling." Then, just before the commercial break, he turned to the mic and said, "Keep listening. We're not done yet." The silence after Kennedy's last words wasn't empty. It was sacred. No one moved. The host didn't reach for his cue cards. The producer didn't dare signal for break. Across the glass, even the assistant normally glued to the countdown clock just sat, hands clasped, eyes wide. The kind of stillness that only happens when truth has cut so cleanly it leaves no room for performance. Then, Kennedy leaned back slightly in his chair and spoke again. But this time it wasn't to the audience. It was directly to Robert De Niro. "You said earlier," Kennedy began, "that my voice sounded like something from a Cracker Barrel commercial, that I talk like someone who skipped grammar class and never came back. Let me ask you something, Robert. Do you know what my first grammar lesson was?" De Niro looked up, hesitant. "It was at my father's funeral," Kennedy continued, his voice still soft but steel-edged. "I was 13. I stood at the pulpit and tried to read a verse from Psalms. I stumbled on the word steadfast. Got stuck in the middle of it. The whole church waited. And when I finally pushed the word out, my mama stood up from the front row, nodded, and whispered, "That's my boy." His eyes locked onto De Niro now. "So no, I don't speak like the men you toast at awards shows. I speak like the boy who had to become a man too soon and never forgot the weight of a single syllable." He turned to the microphone, voice dropping into a rhythm like a hymn. When you mock someone's accent, you're not just mocking how they sound. You're mocking where they come from. You're mocking the late nights they stayed up reading under a flickering bulb, the prayers they whispered with words they didn't yet know how to spell, the letters they wrote to sons at war, with grammar they weren't sure was right, but with love that was. Then he paused, eyes glassy but unbroken. "You mocked the sound of survival, Robert. And that ain't something you can rehearse." The audience outside the studio was no longer passive. On social media, the hashtags had changed from jokes to reckoning. Clips were flooding Twitter. TikTok was already stitching moments together with captions like, "This is what humility sounds like." And in the comment sections, people weren't just reacting. They were remembering, sharing their own stories, of grandmothers with heavy accents who taught them how to love, of fathers who fixed things with their hands and few words, of voices that didn't sound educated, but taught more than any professor ever could. And then, just when it seemed Kennedy had already delivered the knockout blow, he reached into his wallet and pulled out something small, worn, folded like a secret. He unfolded it carefully and held it up. It was an old photo, grainy, black and white, a young man in uniform smiling through the dust. "This," he said, "is Private James Earl Thomas. Never finished high school, never gave a speech, but in his last breath, he told a fellow soldier, 'Tell my mama I spoke proud before I died.'" Kennedy's voice trembled now, not from weakness, but reverence. "That soldier was me." The studio gasped. Even De Niro leaned forward, mouth parted slightly. "He died with an accent so thick, most folks couldn't understand him. But I did, every word. Because truth doesn't need translation. It just needs to be heard." Kennedy set the photo down gently, like placing something holy. "You see, Robert, your job has been to pretend. Mine has been to remember." And then came the line that split the room in two, that would appear on the front page of every major paper within the hour. "You've been acting your whole life. I've been listening my whole life. And today, America just decided which one matters more." For a moment, De Niro looked ready to respond. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, he sat back, face pale, eyes unfocused. The man who once mocked the sound of another man's soul now sat silent before it. A reversal so total it didn't need to be called out. It just was. Kennedy turned to the host and said, "We can take that break now, if you think people still need one." The host shook his head. "No, sir," he whispered. "They're not moving. They're listening." And indeed, across the country, no one had tuned out. Not during the tension, not during the confrontation, and certainly not during the truth. Because what had started as a radio segment had now become something else entirely, something American at its core. A reckoning of voice, of value, and of what it really means to be heard. And just before the show went to commercial, Kennedy spoke one last time, calm and clear. "You can speak like a scholar, or you can speak like a son, but only one of those will be remembered when the lights go out." Then he placed the photo back in his pocket, folded his hands, and sat in silence, because he had nothing left to prove. The commercial break came and went, but no one in the studio moved like it had. The air wasn't just thick, it was charged. The host's voice, usually bright and crisp, returned with an unusual softness. "We're back," he said quietly, "but I think we never really left." He glanced toward Senator Kennedy, then over to De Niro. who now sat stiller than he had the entire broadcast. The man who had arrived with swagger was visibly smaller, not because he'd been attacked, but because he'd been seen. Kennedy didn't start talking right away. He let the silence stretch, respecting it, not rushing through it. Then he spoke again, but this time it wasn't for De Niro. It was for everyone listening. "There was a boy I went to school with," he said, his tone slower, more personal. "Name was Elijah. He stuttered so bad he'd go quiet in the middle of roll call. Kids laughed. Teachers avoided him. But every Friday he'd stay after school and read to the janitor. Not because he had to, because he wanted to practice where no one judged him." Kennedy's eyes softened, voice like memory wrapped in breath. "One day he finally made it through a whole page without stuttering. The janitor clapped. Just once. One loud clap. Elijah smiled, closed the book, and said, 'That's enough for today.' That was the last time I saw him." The host leaned in, whispering, "What happened to him?" Kennedy looked out beyond the glass, as if staring through decades. "He died in a car wreck a week later, 17 years old. But I still hear that clap. I still hear his voice, shaking but brave. Because even when he couldn't speak without trembling, he still spoke." A pause. "That's what courage sounds like. And it doesn't always come in clean grammar or perfect pitch. Sometimes it comes in broken syllables and voices people overlook." De Niro sat stone still, eyes locked on the table, but Kennedy turned back to him slowly. "You mocked my accent," he said again, the repetition now a rhythm. "But what you really did was give the world a mirror. You gave millions of Americans the chance to realize that the way they speak, what they've been told to hide, is exactly what they should be proud of." He leaned forward, voice firm but calm. "Because truth doesn't come dressed up. It walks in barefoot, muddy, and uninvited. But it stays. And it echoes." Suddenly the host's earpiece buzzed. He flinched, then said with surprise, "We're getting thousands of calls, literally. The phone lines are overloaded." He turned to the mic. "We've got someone on the line, Jesse from Kansas. Jesse, you're live." A female voice, older, came through, cracking with emotion. "Senator Kennedy," she said, "I just want to thank you. My husband worked construction for 40 years. He never went to college. But he prayed with our kids every night, taught them right from wrong, and loved this country with his whole being. He passed 2 months ago. And today, for the first time, I feel like someone spoke in his voice again." Kennedy's hand touched his chest gently. "Thank you, ma'am," he said softly. "Sounds like your husband was one of the greatest teachers we never got to meet." Jesse sniffled. He used to say that real men speak gently, because truth don't need to shout. That line landed like gospel. The room fell still again. The host's eyes welled up. The producer turned away from the glass, blinking fast. And De Niro, who once hijacked the mic with a smirk, was now completely quiet, shoulders heavy, face unreadable. Then Kennedy did something unexpected. He stood up, mid-broadcast, reached into his coat, and pulled out an envelope. He placed it in front of De Niro. "In there is a letter," he said, "from a woman who couldn't write her own name until she was 60. She heard you last week mocking people from the South on another program. She mailed me this with help from her granddaughter. She said she wasn't angry, just disappointed. That someone who made his living playing strong men would choose to belittle the voices of real ones." De Niro looked at the envelope but didn't open it. He simply stared. And Kennedy, still standing, said, "We've all said things we regret. The question is, will we keep talking over the people we've hurt, or will we finally listen?" The question wasn't rhetorical. It sat there, raw and unfinished, like a wound waiting to be acknowledged. For the first time, De Niro nodded. Barely, but visibly. A small gesture, but in that moment, it felt like a mountain had moved. And Kennedy, without claiming victory, without rubbing it in, just said, "That's all I ever hoped for." Then he sat back down, folded his hands, and looked straight ahead. And for the first time since the show began, he wasn't the one being looked at. He was the one everyone was now looking through, straight into something deeper. Not a speech, not a defense, a truth that had finally found its volume. The final stretch of the broadcast began not with music, not with an ad, not even with a cue, just a soft exhale from the host, followed by the quiet shuffle of a tissue being passed across the table. The studio wasn't just quiet now, it was reverent. The kind of quiet that happens in a church when someone speaks from a place they didn't plan to go. Kennedy sat calmly, his presence no longer that of a guest, but of something deeper, a witness. And in that stillness, he spoke one last time. "You know, I've been called a lot of things in my life," he said gently. "Country. Simple, old-fashioned. People love those words when they want to pat you on the back and walk away. But what they really mean is, you don't sound like us." He looked toward the mic, toward the millions still listening. "Well, I'm not supposed to. I wasn't raised in halls of influence. I was raised on front porches and back pews. My teachers didn't wear robes. They wore aprons and overalls. And when they spoke, every word meant something." He paused, then reached into his coat one final time, pulling out a small object wrapped in cloth. Slowly, he unwrapped it, a cracked, weathered harmonica. "This belonged to my grandfather," he said, cradling it in his palm. He never said much, couldn't read music. But every Sunday afternoon after church, he'd sit on that porch swing, close his eyes, and play this. And I swear to you, those notes said more than most men ever do. He held it up to the mic. He played in a key that didn't follow rules, but it reached people. The studio was frozen. The harmonica glinted under the soft studio light like an heirloom passed through generations of silence and survival. Then Kennedy looked to De Niro, not with triumph, but with something far more disarming. "Grace, you called me uneducated," he said, repeating the line without venom. "But maybe we've all been educated into forgetting what matters, into speaking louder and listening less, into polishing our sentences while dulling our souls." He turned back to the mic. "I've met men with 4 degrees who don't know how to say, 'I'm sorry.' And I've met women who never finished school but built homes with their bare hands and hearts full of scripture." He glanced downward, voice softening again. "If education is supposed to teach us how to treat people, and we still mock the way they speak, then maybe we've all failed the final exam." The host wiped his eyes. Even the camera crew, off air, stood still. And then, Kennedy leaned into the mic one final time. "So I leave you with this," he said. "If someone ever tells you that your voice doesn't belong, that your accent disqualifies you from being heard, don't change it. Don't soften it. Don't shrink it to fit into someone else's mold. Because your voice is an inheritance. It carries the weight of stories that haven't been told yet. Speak them, all of them. Speak like someone's listening, even when they're not. Because someday, someone will be." He looked up, eyes steady. "And when they do, let them hear you." Not the version they want, the version that survived. For a long moment, no one said a word. The host tried, but his throat caught. Even De Niro, for all his fame and fury, sat completely still, his eyes lowered, his ego left somewhere far behind. The engineer gave a quiet thumbs up behind the glass. The light above the mic turned red, and the broadcast ended, not with applause, but with a long, reverent silence. No outro music, no sponsor message, just silence. But across America, that silence spoke louder than any sound ever could. The internet erupted, hashtags exploded, memes stopped, reaction videos flooded in, people crying, reflecting, apologizing to voices they once laughed at, honoring the accents of parents and grandparents they used to feel embarrassed by. And De Niro. He didn't post. He didn't tweet. He didn't spin. He simply disappeared from the news cycle. For a while. Because sometimes, when you're handed a truth that big, the only honest thing you can do is go sit with it a while. And Senator Kennedy? He walked out of that studio the same way he walked in. Quiet, unshaken, carrying nothing but a harmonica, a folded poem from his mother, and a voice that didn't ask for permission to matter. Because it already did. And if you've ever felt unheard, underestimated, or unseen, if your voice has ever been mocked for being too slow, too thick, too raw, remember this moment. Remember what it taught us all. That sometimes the most powerful sound in the room is the one they tried to laugh off, and it's the one we'll never forget. Now, if that story moved something in you, if you've ever carried a voice others tried to bury, leave a comment. Speak up. Tell us. Because right now, the world is finally listening.